Thank you. Thank you, Ewa. And thank you, Donald. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd just like to, before I go into my comments, to really commend the great work that the Center for International Development at Harvard is doing under Ricardo Hausmann's leadership. There are two reasons why this matters. The first is that I think that we need to nominate Ricardo for the Nobel.
Wow.
And that's an important matter because the work that Ricardo is doing in economic complexity and the structural transformation of nations is the type of work that has such policy impact and significance. You can see the discussions from various countries and the interchanges they are having. And I wonder why the Nobel Committee doesn't see this, or they just see those who have all these abstract equations. So that's my first comment. Secondly, you know, I think that in my life, there are two things that changed my view of the world. One was my doctoral program at the London School of Economics, where I read the work of Hedley Bull called The Anarchical Society. Some may be familiar with it, and it really did show me how the world actually works. So that was the first. And the second was taking Ricardo's class in executive education at Harvard, where he explained this approach to economic growth. And it struck me as really being very, very apt and very, very correct. So I'm very pleased to be here and to say a few words about inclusion, inclusive growth. Donald has made the point about the taxi driver and what he said, we can't eat GDP. And I think that's true because in the book I wrote 2 years ago called Emerging Africa, how the global economy's last frontier can prosper and matter. I did interrogate this topic of what constitutes success, what constitutes transformation. Is it the feeling that Africa is now rising and has wonderful rates of GDP growth for the past decade? And that is true. Like Donald says, the continent has made very important progress. I think we cannot take away from that. But it's important to interrogate the nature of that progress, and that process leads us directly to the question of whether Africa's growth is inclusive or not. Many people have been left behind. 100,000 Africans only produce Africa's GDP. And that's a very sobering statistic. All the electricity in Africa, half of which is produced by South Africa, by the way, is just about equal to the electricity produced in Spain. All of Africa's GDP is just about equal to the GDP of Chicago. So I think this is a very important context in which we should look at what's happening in the continent, because I do believe that we should not worship the gods of small things. I don't believe in chest beating. We've arrived. No, we haven't. We haven't even taken off. That's my position. And it's easy to, you know, in a discussion about inclusive growth, for such a discussion to become a discussion about something else. It could easily become a discussion about inequality. And that's from the American perspective, the 1% problem. We all know the 1% problem, where 1% has more wealth than the rest of the 99%. And this is, of course, a very important concern for the United States and for several developing countries. And that's what Thomas Piketty wrote about a lot when he wrote his book, Capital. We have the 1% problem in developing countries and in Africa. We have even worse than the 1% problem. But that's not what inclusive growth is about. This discussion about inequality fundamentally is about redistribution of wealth. But structurally, the American economy and many developing countries are on structurally sound foundations. But they're dealing with inequality, which is an important problem in its own right. But they have light, they have water, they have maternal health care, they have, you know, they have infrastructure, and they have good educational systems. So, you know, what we are talking about in Africa, you know, in terms of inclusive growth, is a somewhat different thing but it's part of a larger picture. that is related to the 1%, because it's a philosophical, the 1% problem reflects the philosophical conundrum that we have from the uneven distribution of capitalist success. But in Africa, what we're talking about is growth that is actually broad-based across sectors, growth that actually includes different aspects of the population, growth that includes productive employment. That's what inclusive growth is about. It has to be about productive employment. So, and this is a somewhat different thing from inequality, as I was saying. And so what we have is stubbornly high growth, poverty levels in Africa and so many other parts of the world, but especially Africa. In Nigeria, I think our most recent figures from the World Bank was, poverty headcount of about 46% or so. And that's quite high. It has actually come down. It used to be about 61%. And that's very high. And this is a country that has grown for 10 years at about 7% a year. And so a lot of people feel the economy has been liberalized, telecommunications boom, the mobile phone boom. Everybody knows that Africa has more mobile phone density than anywhere else in the world. And sometimes we've confused that for transformation, but that's not what it is. So I think that, inclusive growth is really what we should care about in Africa. And it's become a bit of a buzzword in development economics. I think it was UNDP that said if you ask 5 economists what inclusive growth means, you'll get 6 different answers. But I think it's clear that inclusive growth is growth that is broad-based across different segments of society, across different sectors of the economy, and that it includes a large part of the country's labor force and, as I said, creates productive employment. It has to emphasize equality of opportunity in terms of access to markets, in terms of access to employment, in terms of access to resources, and a level regulatory playing field so that people can engage in business inclusively. And it's one in which the poor are not left out or left behind. Now, there's a bit of a debate in the inclusive growth discussion about social protection and whether that is part of inclusive growth. Now, if you look at inclusive growth as a question of productivity and the participation of different sectors and different classes in productivity, if you look at it as a question of productive employment, you will feel that perhaps the discussion about social protection is a bit of a somewhat different discussion. It's a discussion that is similar to the 1% problem because social protection is extremely important for every economy. So, but is that in itself inclusive growth? Not necessarily, because if you're giving, fiscal transfers to, say, elderly people or to unemployed people, but they're not producing anything, you're balancing out your society in a way that is important, but are they actually contributing to growth? So I think this is an important issue that we need to bear in mind, because in Nigeria, for example, we have a new government that is beginning to focus on social protection and welfare and things like that. And that's very important. But I wouldn't advise them that that is the solution to Nigeria's inclusive growth problem. It could be a part of it, but it's important we understand what it is and what it's not. But I think that inclusive growth is definitely the central challenge of development for African countries such as Nigeria and others, because market-led economies today in the world have created the wealth and prosperity of the modern world. Everybody in the world now is a capitalist. But why is capitalism successful in some places, but it hasn't been very successful in creating the wealth of nations? I'm not talking about the wealth of individuals. We have a lot of individual rich people, and more of them, especially from the middle class. But there are many more people. And so that's why the question of inclusive growth is important, because this question of people left behind is the Achilles heel of Africa's economic growth. And therefore, that economic growth, because it's not based on structural transformation, to me, it's not inclusive. Yeah, I'm being reminded about the time. So let me just wrap up very briefly before we go to the panel, and to say, how can we effectively create inclusive growth in underdeveloped economies? And I think that the answer can be found in a number of things. First of all, conceptual clarity, which is why I talked about inequality as a concept versus inclusive growth as a concept. Talked about inclusive growth specifically versus social protection. So this conceptual clarity is important. Otherwise, public policy can be trying to solve the wrong problem or trying to solve the right problem with the wrong solutions. So that conceptual clarity is extremely important. I believe we should pursue rural-based growth. We've talked a lot about cities here, and I want to be a bit counterintuitive, a bit counter-cyclical, to say that the rural areas in Africa are being left behind. A lot more people are moving to the cities, but are they finding jobs in the cities? In Africa, there's a lot of unemployment, and a lot of it is clustered around the cities. But perhaps a rural growth-based strategy is very important. It's important that we focus on infrastructure. It's important that we think about the role of business. It's important that we think about financial inclusion. Very important for inclusive growth. I read the newspapers in Nigeria this morning and came upon an astonishing fact. 77% of all credit in Nigeria goes to Lagos. Just Lagos. 77%. And this is a country of nearly 200 million people. So Lagos is where it's happening, and pretty much nowhere else. And that's just not inclusive at all. And then I would like to conclude that political leadership is absolutely essential for inclusive growth. Donald talked about political inclusion as the beginning of inclusive growth. And I agree, but I say that political leadership is very important because political leadership needs to ask a number of questions. What is the source of exclusion? How is the exclusion taking place? Why is it taking place? And then build the political platform and the public policy platform to address these questions. Thank you.